that we can send out the recording and the slides with the follow-up email. And then just for everybody that doesn't know me, I'm Cindy Olson, founder of the Executive Strategic Alliance. And in a past life, I was CHRO of Enron. And we're really glad you're here. Please, please, please ask questions. This is a really great topic. And we've got 3 incredible experts here to talk about AI, machine learning, and take advantage of it because they are truly experts in this field. And ask questions, you guys. And here's how we'll handle the questions. You please put them into chat during the presentation, and then hopefully, and I'll monitor those and make sure that they're answered. And then if we have time, hopefully we'll have time. We'll have time for questions at the end as well. And you can come off mic and ask questions. So before we start, just a little bit about ESA. The past 6 years, we've partnered with ADP to build this executive community of over 2,000 participants in around 20 cities, delivering world-class disruptive thought leadership monthly and exposure to innovative technologies. And we're unique in that we bring CHROs, CIOs, and other work tech executives together because we believe that they all have to be in lockstep to deliver the kind of worker experience necessary to attract and retain talent, especially now. We also encourage executives to stay involved in our network, even as they make a change in their careers, by offering a board positioning membership that helps executives with their board journey. And we've also added partnerships that help executives develop what I'm starting to call a portfolio lifestyle, including advisory roles, working with PE firms and VCs. And if they prefer not to continue in a full-time executive role, all of these things are available to them. So today we're honored to have Dr. Steve Hunt, who is the chief expert for work and technology at SAP. He has an undergraduate degree in applied mathematics and a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. He helped create some of the very first applications of machine learning applied to staffing in the early 2000s, and has since worked with a variety of AI and machine learning applications across all aspects of HR in his current role. And joining Steve is Dr. Megan Anzelc, CEO of 3 Arc Advisories. Megan is a physicist who has applied her mathematical expertise to workforce analytic programs in several Fortune 1000 companies that made use of AI and machine learning techniques to influence business decisions. She was the global head of data and analytics at Spencer Stuart most recently, and prior to that, chief analytics officer at Axis Capital. And finally, as a guest executive, joining Steve and Megan today is Piyush Mathur, global HR leader at Johnson & Johnson. Piyush is a passionate corporate entrepreneur with a proven record of business achievements through development of talent and credo-based cultures. He's a bilingual leader with broad HR expertise and a strong business background, leading double-digit growth through unlocking human potential. He currently is leading all aspects of HR in the creation of a publicly listed company as Johnson & Johnson spins off its $15 billion consumer health business. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, but Steve, Megan, and Piyush, I think I didn't do justice to your introduction. So if you want to add a little more texture to who you are, that'd be great. Steve, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, it's really a delight to be here. It's funny, I was talking with Megan and Piyush about this. I would want to have this conversation with Megan and Piyush, even if nobody was listening at all, just because of the work and what they've done. So I will hope that as we're going on and people will put in the chat, I'll do a really brief, little more information about myself, and then Megan and Piyush, I'll let you talk a little more about yourself, and then we're going to, just so you know the format, I'm going to share just a couple general observations and some research that SAP has done around employee attitudes about AI and machine learning. And then we're going to dive into, and we thought this would be different, rather than talk about how is this going to shape the future, which is what most AI things are about, what could happen. We're actually going to talk about, hey, this has been around for a long time. As Cindy mentioned, my very first exposure of building we didn't call it machine learning then, we called it neural network modeling, was in like 2005. It was on clunky technology, but it's been around for a long time. The mathematical techniques, while they are always evolving, the basic concepts have been around for a long time. And what we wanted to talk about today is not so much what's going to happen, what is already happening, and drawing on our practical experiences with those areas. So just really briefly, my role at SAP, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist who basically studies how to use technology to create more effective work environments, cutting all different areas. I have to do this by obligation. I just wrote a book. By law, I have to mention it every time I'm on a webinar. So, hey, if you find the stuff that I talk about interesting, check out my book. I talk about analytics a lot in it, among other things. But with that, Megan, I'll turn it over to you next. Just want to get a little bit more background about yourself and your work in this area before I dive into some more of the slides. Megan, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Steve and Cindy, and I appreciate the introduction. I think what I'll do is just highlight a couple of parts of my background that I think brings a slightly different lens than others who may have kind of grown up in human resources and human capital. So as Cindy said, my educational background's all in physics, and I did a decade of work in the property casualty insurance industry using machine learning and data science to solve business problems. And I bring that up because that industry being highly regulated and a very sort of risk management approach to problem solving is kind of part of my sort of the way that I approach things and think about things. So when I went to Spencer Stuart to build out their first data and analytics function, it was really with that risk management and highly regulated background, sort of bringing that in place to say, how do we do this in ways that are ethical and appropriate? How do we try to remove bias from the process as much as possible? And how do we make sure that we're, documenting what we do and making decisions that we feel that we have good grounding on to defend should there be questions, right? Should regulators come in? And I think this is an area where my expectation is we're going to see a lot more regulation in the human capital space as to how these kinds of tools and approaches are used. So really approaching it with that mindset from the start, a bit different, I think, than perhaps people that have come from other industries and backgrounds. So, but this is going to be a great discussion. I'm super excited.
Great, thanks, Megan. And Piyush?
Yeah, it's thanks for the invite, Cindy. It's great to be with this group. It's an exciting day for us to be together with you, but also personally very exciting because Kenvue, the consumer health arm of Johnson & Johnson, got listed today at New York Stock Exchange. So that's a big thing that I've been working on for the last couple of years. So personally, very gratifying to see that happen. Like Cindy was saying, my background is running businesses around the world. I worked for a company called Nielsen, the TV ratings company, and ran their businesses in different parts of the world. So the question that I mostly get is, why would a business leader move into HR? Like, what's wrong with this guy? Why would you do that? So, for me, when I was running those businesses, it was all about people. It was all about unlocking human potential to drive growth for the company. And I guess my leadership saw that and asked me to see if I was interested in HR, and I pivoted. I think it was a contrarian gambit that I took, but I did that, and I moved over to the dark side, probably, and started to work in HR, with my first role being in workforce analytics, and then I did talent management, and then more recently doing the spinoff. One quick fun fact about me is I've lived in 5 countries, 8 cities, and 17 houses. So I keep telling my wife that she should become a relocation consultant. With that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks. So how we're going to do this, I'm going to present just a few things about artificial intelligence, sort of grounded, and then some data we've seen on employee attitudes about how they want to see artificial intelligence applied. And then I'm actually going to turn off these slides and we're just going to have a conversation talking about how it has been applied. We're going to start with talking about Piyush is going to share work he's done around using AI for learning and opportunity matching. Megan's going to talk about work she's done using AI. And this is really fascinating because I've never heard this before, to improve actually work processes and how people work together. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how it's been used for staffing and how it is being used for staffing. I think all three of us have experience in that area. And then Piyush is going to share some of the research he's done on using it for retention. We're going to focus on not just how it's used, but also getting to Megan's point, how we have to think about it in terms of employees and what are some of the unintentional consequences that could come from using this highly complicated mathematics. And as we go along, encourage people to chat. If you want to come off, I can't see the chat. So Cindy, I'll look for you to do that. But please, people, comment questions. I think Megan and Piyush, I speak for all three of us. We would rather make this a dialogue than just one way, or we'll ask each other questions. So we'll make it work. So really quickly, I think it's important to define artificial intelligence. And actually for me personally, I was sharing this with Cindy, Piyush, and Megan before this. I've been around this for a long time. My dad actually wrote one of the very first books on artificial intelligence. He did his dissertation in the 1950s on modeling thought and decision-making using computers, which is he shared with me that now, the simplest watch in the world has more computer programming now than what he did his whole dissertation on. But and one of the things that he wrote in this book that came out in 75 was, if you ask physicists to define physics, that's a good question for you, Megan, they'd probably find substantial agreement on what it was. But if you ask people to define artificial intelligence, you'd get all over the board what it is. And I think that one of the things that we really need to do about artificial intelligence is actually, I wish we could stop using the term. There's nothing artificial or intelligent about it. It's just math. It's complex mathematical pattern recognition systems. Now, there's two kinds of artificial intelligence. I think it's thrown into categories. There's the stuff we're going to mainly talk about because it's been around and used a lot more, which is the pattern recognition predictive algorithms that are saying, okay, based on past patterns, what is likely to happen, like what jobs are likely to be good for people, what training might be interesting to them, are they likely to quit? We're going to talk about that because that's been used a lot more because basically the computer power to do it has been around longer. The stuff that everyone is talking about now is the other side of AI, which is generative AI, which creates content. But even that, I think it's important to remember that Chat GPT and all of the content it's creating was originally created by a human. It doesn't come up with novel thought on its own. It just takes stuff that other people have done, put on the web, and recombines it in different ways. I made a comment on that. It's kind of like rom-com movie plots. It's always the same plot, just put together in different ways. And so, and we're not going to talk as much about generative AI just because, again, we wanted to focus on what has been used as opposed to what could be used. Although, generative AI has been around for a while too. It would be a whole different webinar. So let's focus on sort of the applied side of this as opposed to the speculative side. We did a study at SAP a couple of years ago when this first, and this was not about generative AI, this was more about the, again, predictive AI, where we actually asked people how they felt about these intelligent technologies. And it was interesting because it wasn't like people fell into one category or the other. Most people are optimistic about it. They're like, yeah, this is going to make our life better. But there is a lot of anxiety around it, partially, I think, because people don't understand it. And that's where I'd go back to that point again. It doesn't help our cause to call it artificial intelligence and give it this image of some sort of Terminator robot thing. It's just mathematics. Matter of fact, I was on a conference with the International Bar Association, and they're talking about the New York law about banning AI. And he's like, that's like banning math. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. So when you talk about it, I guess I'd start with downplay the language and focus on just the boring mathematical parts of it. What we also found, I thought was really interesting in this research, is we asked people how they wanted it to be used. It was really clear a pattern came out of it. People want the technology, not surprisingly, to enable them. They like it when it helps them to do tasks easier, helping them with scheduling. They like it like chatbots that ask questions, automating things, suggesting learning courses. people are far more anxious about it when it's evaluating them, and evaluating in any type of way, even like doing exit interviews by things. They're like, no, a human should be involved in anything that has an emotional component to it. Like, do I get a job, or why am I leaving this job, or why am I going to quit? And that's where people are kind of like, no, you're over relying on math. Now, I don't think that doesn't mean we can't use AI in that area, but I think when it comes to evaluation, we have to be a lot more sensitive to people want to know a human is involved in any process that makes a decision that affects their life in a material way, like whether or not they get a job. And so I think this makes sense intuitively. It's kind of interesting to see how it played out so clearly when we actually studied research on it. So with that being said, that's kind of setting the stage. And now I want to talk just more about how we've used it. I'm going to start, we're going to go through 4 areas. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see my colleagues' faces in larger format, hopefully. And I will start, Piyush, with your first experience with using AI for what's called opportunity matching. Can you talk about how you've applied it to help existing employees to advance their careers, and what have been some of the challenges and benefits as you've gone along doing that?
Sure, Steve. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the areas where we use AI is in the learning space. The problem, Steve, we had was, telling our employees that they should take control of their career. They should be like the CEOs of their career. And the employees were asking us back that they would want a personalized plan on how to get there, how to meet their aspirations. So that was a challenge for us, because it was 140,000 employees at J&J. How do you personalize a learning and development plan that's based on their skills and aspirations and past experiences? So what we did was we followed a 3-way process. The first one was defining the skills. We built a skills ontology, made sure that they were aligned with the different jobs that we had. And that took a lot of effort because there was no common definition. People referred to different skills and different roles. So getting that aligned and building that skills ontology was very important, that everybody was on the same platform when it came to those definitions. And then we started to measure, from employees' experiences, their job profiles, their workday profiles, on what their skills were. And we asked them about their aspirations, any other skills that they had built, because they now knew that this was going to be used for them so that they can get future opportunities within Johnson & Johnson. And that really actually helped us build a lot of information about our employees, which many times exists on external platforms, but do not exist on internal platforms. And then finally, we put to use, where we started to use their aspirations, their experiences, the skills that they talked about, and started to match them with all the learning programs. So if I was aspiring to be a head of HR of a particular business, they looked at my skills and said, you've not had these experiences, so you should be doing this particular training program. You should be doing a gig. So we started to match gigs within the company. And these are like 3-month assignments just for you to get a flavor of the role. And then matching them to actual roles that were out there. So we followed that. I think one good thing about this was the fringe benefit that we got from this exercise and continue to get, was really trying to understand what the aspirations of our employees are. And does that happen to be in sync with where the organization is going? So I'll give you one example. Our medtech business is moving, gradually towards robotics and digital surgery. We will require a lot of data science skills in the company. So we could look at the back end and see how many people are aspiring to be data scientists in our company. And does that meet the requirement of the future that we will have, given where we are going and where our business is going? So I think that was a really good fringe benefit, which can then help us decide what the HR strategy is, whether we are going to build from inside, recruit from outside, borrow, or even bot. So that's where we are.
That's a great example. And I mean, in the HR tech space, these things are called opportunity marketplaces that you're using. And there's a lot of companies that have them. SAP has them, our partners have them. There's a lot of different ones out there. And it is exploding because I think if you look at it, it definitely ties on that left-hand side. It's helping you find opportunities. It's helping advance your career. But you kind of touched on several things that I want to ask you about, which is the first one is garbage in, garbage out on these things. You know, if you don't have good skills data. So I have a question on the skills data, but I also have even more interesting question on the interest data, because that gets where people can feel a little bit nervous about it and kind of gets at Rick's question, actually. So the first one I have is the skills. How did you build the skills? Because companies have been trying to build skills inventories for a long time. And I know that a lot of these opportunity marketplace vendors say, we can come in and we can build a skills inventory for you using the magic of machine learning. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't know. It requires you can get the data. So how did that work in building the skills ontology to begin with? How much of that was manual and how much of that was just automatic?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And there can be a whole session, Steve, on just that, because there was so much of effort that went into it. My colleague actually worked on it. We looked at skills offered by different companies. You know, a lot of companies have their own skills ontology. We reviewed them, saw them, how it kind of matched with what we were looking for, which one came the closest. We actually created some hybrids, and then finally decided on a particular vendor to largely help us out with the skills ontology. I think that is one part of the story. The other part is really matching it to job profiles. And some of that, I don't think we are 100% there. We continue to build because skills continue to evolve. And we have to make sure that it's something that's always in progress. But I think to a large extent, we have now matched jobs and the kind of skills that we need.
I think that's a really good point. So I think one of the things, and having seen a lot of these technologies, is the best ontologies, the skills ontologies, there's a lot of organic intelligence in there. The companies and vendors that do it well are actively managing those. It's not just blind pattern recognition. And the other point that you hit is if you're getting ready to put these systems, you have to link them to your jobs, which means you need to have your job structure organized. And I'll tell you, a lot of organizations don't have their job profiles well organized. The next question I have, and I've got 4 questions on related to that, and then we're going to switch to Megan. But then the next question I have has to do with asking people about their interests. And Rick, this kind of gets a little in your question, which is, it's one thing for me to tell you about what my tangible objective skills and experiences are. And actually these systems are really powerful for that. By the way, one of the great things they do is they talk about adjacent skills. They say, well, if you learn how to do this, you're probably able to learn how to do something else you may not even realize. So they're really powerful for what's called adjacent skills and things like that. But the other one is, what do you want to do? And that's a very personal question. And you could say, what I want to do is stop working in my current job and not work for my manager and do something else. You know, there could be some downsides to sharing that data. How did you manage that? Were employees like, yeah, I'll put in my job vocational interest, no problem, you know, or was there sort of like a trust issue there that came into that, sharing more personal data?
Yeah, and we try to provide some guidelines so that it doesn't go vary and it remains within the guardrails a little bit. So we said there are different career pathways that you could take. So that's a broad guideline. And you know, I'll give you some examples. It could be that I want to become a subject matter expert in HR. It could be that I want to be a CHRO in the future. Right? It could be that I want to be in a particular sector in pharmaceuticals and I want to really develop my expertise there. So you could choose a particular pathway and then you can talk about, okay, I'm a manager today. I am looking to be a director in 5 years, right? So you're giving good indications of the track you want to be on and the level that you aspire to reach. And then from that, we know enough about you, or the system knows enough about you to start saying, oh, Piyush, you've not had this particular experience. There is one gig that is relevant for you. Maybe you are interested. Or there is a role that's coming up. Maybe that's another one that if you go into that role, it prepares you for that director role that you aspire for.
I really like that approach because I think a lot of people, employees, one, struggle to talk about what I personally want to do, but what you're using is, speaking as a psychologist, is something called possible selves. You tell people, here are the possible selves you might become. You might become a data analyst. You might become a business project leader.
AWS.
And people.
The other thing I was thinking about when I read that was
Tyler, we've got
from a design philosophy, and this is something I'm intuitive.
Sorry, I muted. And that's okay, Cindy. I don't know if that was intentional. Tyler, if you wanted to share a question, please let us know. But going back, so Piyush, what you're talking about is something called possible selves, which is you're giving people a sense of what they might become, and it's easier for people to evaluate that than telling them more broadly. And I like that structuring career paths, which of course, again, you've got to have to make these tools really work really well. The last question I have is on the actual recommendations of gigs and stuff like that. Two questions on that. One, did you run into issues where it made recommendations that were like, hey, this is what I did 4 years ago. Why are you asking me to do this now? And it's almost, because that loses the credibility of the tool. And the second one is, what if they can't do it? Like, how do you manage the fact that, and I've had this when I've talked to other operations leaders, they're like, yeah, if I drop this AI tool, we're going to say, hey, you could do this. Here's a gig. And their manager be like, yeah, but who's going to do your job when you're gone? You know, it kind of gets into that. And that's not managers hoarding talent, by the way. That's managers doing what they're supposed to do, which is deliver results. So how did you manage that? Did you run into any issues with that? And do you have any lessons learned from that last sort of like recommendation portion of it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Steve. So, before setting up this whole system, there were some recommendations that were going from the system to people. And exactly to your points, like, what? You're asking me to do a manager role? I'm already a senior manager and stuff like that, because there's not enough information that was going in. But since we've set up the system, the recommendations are better, is what I would say. The system is learning, right? It takes time to improve. And we pitched it like that let's do a pilot, let's start with this. There will be things we will learn in the process. It will get better. And I think that's how the expectations were set. But I think just, again, my final point would be, you got to make sure there's a common definition. You have to make sure that you're measuring it right. And then evaluating at the back end people and employee feedback on what recommendations were coming, how many gigs are actually happening, what roles they applied for just because it got recommended to them. I think those analytics will really help us fine-tune the system going forward.
I think that's good. So it goes back that you need some organic learning in addition to the machine learning of just actually managing that. I always use the example of this technology. You're not building a house, you're planting a garden. You need to maintain it over time. Thanks. Well, thanks, Piyush. That's really fascinating. I think on that one, kind of the big takeaways I took on that, by the way, is you got to have the right content to begin with, skills and job profiles for one of these systems to work. But, there's a lot of help out there in doing it. I like that idea of like career pathing. People don't necessarily know what they want to do, so provide them some structure so they can have some idea of what they might do. And then the last one is on that sense of be ready to manage this over time. Tell people, hey, it's not going to be perfect. All right, Megan, we're going to switch to yours now. So we're going to go through 4 of these, everyone. So the next one is about process improvement. And Megan, when you shared this was fascinating because I've been in this space for a long time and I'd heard what you've been done for like technology process. There's a solution, SAP has a solution called Signavio that does machine learning to analyze business processes, but I'd never heard it for like human work processes. So Megan, talk a little bit more about how you've used AI for process improvement.
Yeah. So Microsoft published quite a bit on this about how they were using some of the data that they had, predominantly email and calendar data. Right. So it's passive data collection. You're not asking anybody to contribute information or, Piyush, some of the things you were talking about around, skills and identifying what you want to do, right, requires users to participate and add data. So this is not that. This is all passive data collection. It's stuff your information security team likely already captures. And Microsoft had done a number of analyses on their own internal operations, more around things like what size of meetings becomes ineffective, right? When it's over, 20 or 30 people. And we kind of all know that, right? There's some heuristics we all use for things like that, but this was really putting data to it and then showing correlations to things like employee engagement. What we were doing was really using it around understanding how teams that were assigned to a project or a search assignment, how they were operating and how they were collaborating. And then looking to say, are there collaboration patterns that are correlated to better business outcomes? So if you can place an executive more quickly, you can take on more business as a whole, right? As an example. So are there collaboration patterns, both in how the assignment teams were collaborating with each other, as well as how they were collaborating with the client organization, right? Or with candidates? And are there patterns around that seem to be correlated to better outcomes for everybody? So it was a bit different approach than the way that Microsoft had been using it, but similar kinds of data, right? All passive data collection. Now, of course, that data is not fully, you don't have 100% of the information. If you texted a candidate on your personal cell phone, we wouldn't know that. But to get a good sort of rules of thumb around what kinds of patterns were emerging. Another use case in this was also around how people work in distributed workforces. So especially as companies are trying to bring people back to offices, a company like Spencer Stuart that operates globally, where people are highly distributed across the world, how are people collaborating across office versus with people in their own physical office, right? And what does that look like? And how is that correlated, not just to business outcomes, but also sort of indirect outcomes like employee engagement, right? So you could start using data like this to get a handle on things that are historically very difficult to measure. But again, using passive data where you're not asking people to contribute information, just using what they have there. Now that data is obviously messy, so there's a lot of natural language processing that has to go into analyzing, and obviously a level of security and access restriction, because it's not like anybody's reading your emails, right? Nobody actually wants to be doing that. But how can you get themes and identify projects off of subject lines? Or calendar invite attendee lists, right? Those sorts of things. So it's less about the specific, sentences you were exchanging and more about the metadata from that passive data collection. So I'll pause and see if you had parts of that you wanted to dig into, Steve.
I think one of the things you're talking about is something that has been made possible because of the move to a digital sort of virtual world. That even if you're in offices, we're still, as we're now really embraced hybrid, now most meetings will have somebody that's not in the room, which means you're probably using some digital tool as part of that communication. What this leaving is, you say, this sort of passive data, digital trace. And I would say this is allowing us to study one of the things that I've always, as a psychologist, been super frustrated about, which is everyone knows businesses run off of relationships, not off of org charts. But historically, companies never measure relationships. They don't know who talks to who. And when you see, it's called in psychology, it's called organizational network analysis. Right. When you go in, you discover that there are people that have far more influence and has nothing to do with where they are on the org chart. It's the people that interact with a lot of other people, but also then get burned out. So I think that this application is really powerful. I'm curious for two questions. First, where would you recommend companies go to find this data? Like you mentioned Teams, but there's other places too that you're seeing emerging, into this data. And the other issue is the people feeling like, are they okay that you're measuring this stuff? How do you manage that people don't feel that just like, hey, stop spying on me?
For sure. So, so in terms of where you can get the data, right, I'm not getting paid to mention Microsoft, but they have a product that they've been very public about. So if you're using the Microsoft Office suite in your organization, you already have access to some of this data. They aggregate it. The sort of out of the box analytics that they give you is fairly operationally focused. So it was different than the ways we wanted to use the data. But they give you some metrics kind of out of the box, and it's all aggregated and anonymized. So you can't see individual behaviors. You can only look at like cohorts. So if you want to look at individual contributors versus managers, or, you know, the Chicago office versus the New York office, right? You can do things like that, but you can't like drill all the way down to say, you know, how many emails was Steve sending versus Piyush, and I'm going to, you know, infer something from that. So it's not that level of detail. It's not identifiable information. So that's one piece. Other kinds of information that organizations are using for this is their CRM tools. Right, you could be using your ATS and within your HR space, but certainly CRM tools, especially around the sales pipeline and what that looks like. And again, there's obviously lots of data coming in through that, but then tying to some of the organizational data as well. So it is, you know, it's an application of organizational network analysis, ONA, but there are opportunities now to combine that sort of internal operational data and internal communication with external facing, right? How are you talking to clients, to customers, to prospects? And how can you kind of merge those to look at what are the patterns across your different communication channels to better understand what's most effective?
Yeah.
And then to your question about the privacy piece, so absolutely right, this is very sensitive. Now, obviously, most organizations probably all have language in place that says presume no privacy, right? Effectively, when you're using company tools, they have the right to view and use your data in any way they see fit, right? Some language to that sort of effect. For us, before we engaged on even starting to look at the data, when it was sort of a very just concept level, we engaged with our CHRO, with our chief legal counsel, with our information security team, right? With all of those different parts to say, are we comfortable with this? What can we put in place to help you feel more comfortable? So things like access restriction, right? So there were very few people, I think it was 2 individuals who had access to the data at all at any level of granularity. And then aggregate statistics that were anonymized, right? Where you can make more widely available. And then continuing to engage our CHRO throughout the process to say, okay, here's what we're finding. Because the other part is you may find things that are tricky to communicate in a way that makes sense, right? If you find that multiple team meetings at the start of a project leads to better outcomes, you may not want to encourage everybody to meet 14 times in the first week of their project, right? You got to be careful about how you message what you're learning so that you're encouraging the right sorts of behaviors so that you actually get the benefit from it. The idea is not to create more meetings for meeting's sake, right? Nobody's trying to do that. Instead, trying to find what are some patterns that seem to be true across, you know, people who have been able to be, you know, have the most success in the organization.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Pish. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a quick comment here. We did organizational network analysis within J&J, and I see a lot of HR folks here and IT folks. So I'll tell you about 2 functions. Within the HR function, some of that analysis showed us that our BU HR community can actually spend much more time with the business than they were spending with the business. So they were spending a lot of time within the HR function and not enough with the business leaders. That was a really good insight. We worked on it and it drove a lot of outcomes. In the IT function, we found a lot of meetings were happening. And Microsoft also defines what is a redundant meeting. So it actually told us how many were actually redundant meetings that could be, you know, taken away, or you actually didn't need to do them. And that really led to a lot of productivity. So yeah, a couple of good examples.
I think it's those insights. And I think that, you know, if you look at this one and where I would characterize this, and Megan Pugh weigh in if you disagree, is where we are in the studying of relationships and internal processes with AI is we have a lot of really good data. There actually are some cool tools that do analyze like email at the manager level and tell managers, hey, you're giving this person nothing but critical feedback. You're not even talking to this person. So there's some cool tools that analyze this. But the key is the transparency to employees to say, hey, we're trying to make your life better. And we know we need meetings, but what are the most effective ones and things like that. Where I think we are on this, though, is there's no, I haven't seen it. There's very few sort of out of the box organizational network analysis tools that you could just drop and apply. It's more like this is something that requires a data scientist to go in and have a discussion. I think we will start having sort of out of the box tools, but we're not there yet. But it is super powerful. When I think about this in the hybrid world, relationships, teams, people's burning out, these edicts of like, we shouldn't have any meetings are stupid. But also we don't want more meetings, to your point, Megan. So getting more insight into think this is a really powerful area where I think we're going to see a lot more explosion in use of AI. Last comment too on the privacy thing. That is, for the most part, I don't like generational differences because they tend to be really ageist. There are differences in attitudes about privacy. Digital natives tend to think nothing is private. And so they're like, hey, everything. So you should be transparent, but it is interesting that you're going to probably hear more privacy concerns from your older employees than your younger employees, because it's a reflection of the world that we grew up in. Okay, we're going to go to the next one, which is candidate selection. And Rick, you were asking about personality attributes and stuff on morale. That thing gets into this area where you are actually evaluating the person. So far, we've been talking about evaluating opportunities. We've been talking about evaluating relationships. I hate it when I hear AI, selection companies saying, well, we're actually making selection decisions. Like, yes, you are. If you're recommending one person over another, you are evaluating people. That's okay. We have to do it. It's part of hiring. We can't hire everyone. But I've had a lot of experience in this one. This is probably the one that's talked about the most, but I'm curious, Piyush or Megan, have you applied at scale machine learning and artificial intelligence to your staffing?
Megan, you want to go first? You want me to go first?
Whichever, doesn't matter to
You
me.
can go on, Piyush. We'll have you go first.
I go first? Yeah. So, I was reading the Shrum report, AI in HR 2022. Some of these panel discussions, when you come on them, you actually read a little bit more than usual. So I found in that they're talking about almost 2/3 of the companies are now using to screen candidates through AI or automation. So it's actually picked up pretty much. We looked at it. I'll tell you our situation in J&J. We get 1.2 million resumes a year. We hire 24,000 people. So it's a 2% acceptance rate. I often go to my son and say it's more difficult to get into J&J than into Harvard. So it's true. It's actually twice as difficult, because if you look at their acceptance, like 4.5%. So we, did some rigorous testing over the years before we even thought about implementing something with a vendor. We went details into looking at how explainable their AI was. Why were they screening one candidate versus not the other? And going into that kind of detail, and probably 18 to 24 months of just looking at the data and what it was doing before applying actually helped us build the process and go through that whole phase. It's a company that we work with. I'm not trying to promote any vendors here, but we found them to be GDPR compliant, EEO compliant. We looked at their algorithm where we had concern. They took good feedback and really made it work for us. So yeah, I mean, there's a huge opportunity there. A lot of companies are doing it, but always you have to keep a close eye on watching it. And the other thing I would say, Steve, is with this New York law that's coming, 144, going live July 5th, requires you to validate your AI irrespective of which vendor you use, which is going to be interesting as well. I mean, I know we can leave it for another discussion, but that's coming at us. Regulations are coming at us. But if you have already tested and already thought about why the selection is happening of certain candidates versus others, I think that's an important piece that we have done in the past. But again, new learnings will happen as we do these audits.
Yeah, well, I think of the New York law too, that we should basically saying you should validate mathematical selection procedures, which you should. There's all these companies that use tests that have got no validation at all, which I think is a good thing. And I think if you talk to the, the good vendors, there's a question about, how do we move the black box mystique? I personally find that when I talk to selection vendors in AI, the ones that are really good, they want to talk to you about how to explain it. They want to dive into the math. They do a lot of analysis. They don't just say, oh, we use machine learning. It's like, what do you actually predict and measure? And they have but to do that, those are the organizations that have a lot of people that are dedicated to doing that. They employ pretty much larger staffs of, often IO psychologists or similar. It's the ones that are dangerous are somebody that's like, hey, I got some old personality test and I found a machine learning algorithm and now I'm off to the races without actually doing what. But that's been true for personality testing forever. There's always been shady stuff out there. I think the stakes are higher though when you apply machine learning to it. Megan, what about you? Any thoughts do you have on the staffing one on this? And then we're going to talk about retention.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things. So to sort of build on the piece around, transparency and, sort of validating the usage of tools. I think this is where, my background coming from a very highly regulated industry has played a big role, right? Because of asking a lot of those questions, both of vendors and of my teams around, how much data is it built on, which countries, right? Which job families, because that doesn't always translate everywhere else, right? And then how did you validate? How do you continue to update and so on? So, and I think that transparency piece is important. So having gone through regulatory conversations in insurance to convince regulators in each of the 50 states year after year around what you were doing and how you were doing it and how it was fair and appropriate. I think those kinds of experiences can be really helpful in this space as well, right? Whether it's from insurance or financial services more broadly. In terms of how we were using it, the whole executive search industry operates very differently than the way that Piyush was describing, right? It is a very relationship-driven industry, and it is predominantly going after passive candidates. So there is no publicly posted job, right? You're not having applicants apply to the job and express interest. Instead, it's the other way around. You have recruiters in the marketplace who are reaching out to executives to identify if they have interest and then evaluating their potential fit to the role. The ways in which that people do that, there can be opportunities for bias. And so part of, the approach was to say, well, it's very hard to fully remove bias, but can you reduce it? Can you make it better than it is today? So for example, if you talk to executive search consultants and you say, okay, you have a new assignment from a client, a role you're trying to fill, what's the first thing you do? Like, how do you get started? Many of them will tell you, oh, I talked to some of my colleagues and we brainstorm about who we know who might be a good fit for the job. Right? What are some executives that come to mind that we think could be really good for this? To my mind, that raises a potential flag of recency bias. You're only going to think of the people that you have interacted with or spoken with relatively recently. You may miss somebody who's very good fit to the role, but you just haven't talked to them in 5 years, or you don't even know them. They're not part of the pool of executives that you know personally. But their profile is in your database or it's on LinkedIn. So we were using it in ways to try to say, can we make some recommendations as a very early first pass? So not removing human from the loop, right? Very human-driven process, but can we give some initial suggestions that are based on the skills and experiences, right? So that you could surface people who might not otherwise be considered just because, they haven't been spoken with in a number of years, right? Or they're a new individual to kind of the team. There's other reasons to do it as well, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, I think, Megan, that you've hit on some really good points that, and before we go to the last one, retention. First of all, better than it was. I think that's one of the things when we look at using things for selection, it's like, look, we have to make selection decisions and you've got to compare to what the alternative is. As Piyush, you shared, what do you get, like 3% of the people apply. So we're going to be rejecting a lot of people. The question is, how can we improve so that, and that we're getting the right people? The second thing too is people never talk about the positives. We only focus on who doesn't get jobs. And I think emphasizing more that we've discovered people that got opportunities. And this gets into, I wrote a book, my first book was called Hiring Success, that talked about assessment tests. The original reason we started using assessment tests like the SAT was so that some kid, and the guy actually built the SAT, as an example, some bright kid working on a farm in Iowa had a chance of getting to Harvard, even though they had no family connections, didn't know anyone. So we never think about these tests in the sense of, I think, how they unlock opportunities, sort of like going back to what Piyush was talking or at the beginning. So I think when we talk about this, we need to do more emphasizing about how they help people find opportunities. But the last one, I think, is really important, Megan, on bias, because when I was building neural network modeling, once we had a customer that saw a bias in their hiring, we went through and looked at it, and they of course immediately accused the test. We went through and looked at it, and we had a lot of mathematics, and we studied the heck out of this thing to make sure it wasn't biased. When we went through all the hiring decisions, where do you think the single biggest place all of the bias appeared? Was it the sourcing, the staffing, or the manager interview? It was the manager interview. And it was funny because when we shared those results, you've never seen something emails labeled with attorney-client privilege faster in your life.
I think the point you're raising, Steve, is a good one in that, so AI can and should be used to help solve some of these big, difficult, challenging problems. Things like using structured interviews, right? And a common set of questions that you ask every candidate has been proven over and over again to be a useful and helpful tool. So even just putting into place some basic foundational things, that's not AI, right? It's very little lift. There's no big technology spend. You don't have to hire special skills, but that can have a meaningful value. So I think it's about, finding the places where AI is appropriate and the right solution. And then where are places where you can use very simple, light touch, light implementation to also drive improvements in the process, right? And there's opportunities across that spectrum.
Yeah. And I think one of the things too you touched on too is the bias, which is, remember, AI uses past patterns. And so as we're going to increasing staffing shortages, one of the biggest issues we have in the United States is there's about 1/3 of the talent pool that is vastly underutilized. It's the 1/3 of the US population that has no education past high school. That if you use AI using your traditional sourcing for professional jobs, it will probably never look there. So part of this is pushing ourselves to get these AI algorithms to look beyond the traditional sources, because again, they're based on past patterns. So I think that's an important thing. But that being said, we can actually track it because it's all mathematical as opposed to just subjective. I do think this is
that was part of what we were doing in our approach, because especially when you think about executive search levels, right? So I feel like I have to call this out to make sure everybody understands we were being appropriate in how we were doing things. If you look at the historical data for C-suite and CEOs of, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, overwhelmingly white and male, right? So exactly to your point, Steve, it's not just about some of the traditional attributes, but it's also about how do you ensure that you're not accidentally identifying proxies for being white or being male, so that you're not, right, so that you're creating an approach that actually is helping to level the playing field, right? Because you cannot just take historical data and use it, right? Again, very easy to build models, very hard to build models that are actually beneficial and useful and actually make things better. That's very difficult to do.
Absolutely. And I do think on this one with staffing, particularly if you're a high volume where you are sort of like a legal risk, this is a place where it really makes sense to get a professional, somebody really skilled, a third-party person. It's kind of like benefits packages. These are insanely complex. Unless you've got a pretty robust internal analytics team. I think if I was going to put in place AI and select a vendor, I'd want to work with a third party of some sort that could come in who really understands how these things work, because it is very complicated and the stakes are pretty significant, especially with these laws like in New York and stuff like that. We only have like 4 minutes, but I want to get the last one, which was retention. So we've hired them, but now they're in. How have you used AI to proactively identify turnover risk?
Yeah, and that's something that I did, Steve, and both Nielsen and J&J. And it's probably one of the areas which can really create an outcome for the business. I often say insight without outcome is overhead. And in many times we get these insights, we take actions, but we forget to measure the outcomes of those actions. And I think that is still an overhead if you don't get to the outcomes you were hoping for. So a quick 1 minute on retention, with a example from China. We actually had a big churn that was happening in China, and we quickly built our regression model there and identified what were the key drivers of attrition and retention. And we were able to, like, one example was we found that lateral moves were as good as promotional moves for retention. But we were doing promotions twice than lateral moves in China. So the following year, we started to do many more lateral moves, and we found attrition come down and had a millions of dollars of productivity impact on the company. So it's really leading those insights, taking those actions, and then driving outcomes for the business.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea how you found like very specific insights. Like Megan, you used AI to find that kickoff meeting in the relationships, Piyush, in this lateral moves, that there's a lot of sort of spot applications to it that I think are really powerful. So again, it's all limited based on the data you have, but I think it is a super powerful tool that allows us, as we have more of this data available, to actually use it. I mean, the big problem in HR is not that we don't have enough data, it's using the data we have. And this tool is a really effective tool for doing that. Well, hey, everyone, I'm going to chat a few books as we were talking that I think are really useful that dive into this. By Michael Arena, Adaptive Spaces and Organizational Network Analysis. A book called Decoding Talent by Eric Seidel on using AI for selection. And of course, I got to put in my own book, Talent Tectonics. But I know we're right at time. I wanted to thank Megan and Piyush for a fascinating conversation. Cindy, for making this all happen. I hope people enjoy this. I certainly learned a tremendous amount from the conversation. I haven't personally crunched numbers in a long time, but it kind of makes me want to go back and see if I can still remember how to do it.
Hey, wow, you guys, this was an amazing session. You can kind of see that from the chat and the comments. Really appreciate it. We could have gone on for another hour, I think. Megan, it was great to have you. Piyush, it was wonderful to have you. And Steve, great moderation. I think AI is a topic we should do again. So everybody look for our next Thought Leadership Forum in June. I think we're going to talk about AI again. Hopefully we can have one of these guys back. So thank you, everybody, for being here. If you notice, Steve put some stuff in chat, and I will send out the recording and these slides, and I'll also make sure you get what Steve put in chat as well in our follow-up email. Thanks, everybody. Steve, Megan, Piyush, bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
you.
Okay.